All right, well, without further ado, I'm going to let our presenters take over. So we'll have Mary and Greg talk about the resource directory dilemma. They're coming from the Open Referral Initiative. So yeah, we'll learn more about why there isn't, and probably won't be, a Yelp for social services.
Great, thanks, Samantha. My name is Mary Kuhn, and I first came to Shy Hack Night in 2015. I had just moved back to Chicago from New York, and I was looking for a way to meet people, find a job, and be part of something positive. Shy Hack Night helped me with all three of those things. And I've heard about Greg's work in 2014 back in New York, an open referral when I was at a hack night in New York City. And 8 years later, we started working together. And the friends and connections that I made through the civic tech community made that possible. Greg is the founder of Open Referral, which promotes open access to information about health, human, and social services available to people in need. While he was working at Bread for the City, a nonprofit in DC, he saw the need to bring coordination and technology to resource directories that nonprofits, government agencies, and even hack nights struggle to maintain. Through a lot of hard work, research, and patience, Open Referral was born in 2012 in partnership with Code for America and the Ohana Project. Now, Open Referral is a community of practice with pilot projects around the world. I'm happy to introduce Greg Bloom to tell you more about the Open Referral story. Take it away, Greg.
Okay, let me see. Let me get the screen share up here. Somehow it's disappeared. Thank you for the introduction. It's great to be back at Chicago Hack Night. I've been here once before as a visitor. Excited to be back as a presenter. Let's see. Y'all see the screen? There we go. Okay, great. So this is a problem I've been working on for a long time. We've made a lot of progress. Thanks to actually some folks in Chicago along the way. Shout out to Derek and the Dedupe team who've been great advisors over the years. Also, thank you, Derek, for introducing me to Mary. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to work with Mary. I hope that through this talk, we find opportunities to work together there in Chicago. I think there's a lot of opportunity to find new ways through this problem there. So I talk about resource directory information in the title of this talk. Another way to understand that is the stuff that you need to see the safety net meaning the programs offered by governments and nonprofits to meet people's needs, health, human, and social services. The problem is that it's very difficult to actually find trustworthy information about that. If we were in a room together, if I could see y'all's faces, I would ask right now whether how many of you have been at a hack night or a hackathon or some sort of innovation event and heard someone say, we're going to build the centralized clearinghouse of all community resources. Usually when I ask that question in this space, almost everybody raises their hand. They've heard it before. It's one of the most common problems to emerge. This is a problem that I found out about actually working in the field of health, human, and social services in the District of Columbia. Over 10 years ago, an organization called Bread for the City in DC is where I found this problem. Bread has a food pantry, the biggest in the city, and a clothing bank. They have a health clinic, they have a legal clinic, and they have social workers. And the social workers on Friday afternoons would maintain a database that they built in Microsoft Access over 15 years ago. What I discovered when I was working there as the communications guy was that we were known to have the best source of information about the services in the city. And in fact, our social workers knew that people would come to us just to get the information that they figured they could trust about where else to go to get help. So it increased the workload on our social workers to maintain it, but there was no other reliable source of this information. Several times over the first couple years that I was there, I was like, this is ridiculous. We should have a centralized clearinghouse of all the resources available to people in need. And I'd go to hack nights like this back in 2010, 2011, and talk to people about like, why isn't there a centralized database? And I even saw Code for America in their inaugural class launched a project called Open 211, originally called the Redirectory Project. And over the course of several years, my enthusiasm for the technology that I figured would solve this problem with, imminently, that enthusiasm was a little dampened. What I saw was quite a few projects that actually sputtered out and failed, and others turned into sort of competitive versions of themselves that ended up making the problem worse. And so before I dig in quickly, just to define what we're talking about, resource directory information, by that I mean which organizations provide what services, where are they located, how are they accessed. This information you'd assume would be readily available or something that you could just open up, but it actually turns out to be very slippery. And it's not as simple as what you'd expect on a Yelp for social services. We're used to, as consumers, just like typing in like, this is what I want, and then getting it. But when it comes to social services, you have organizations that provide many different kinds of services in different combinations at different facilities. They have complex requirements as to who is eligible for what. They describe those services in different ways, depending on who you are. If you're a donor or a manager or a person seeking help, they'll use different vocabularies to describe the same services. And there isn't really like one government agency that oversees all of this. Even the federal government, the IRS collects 990 forms, but they don't actually collect this information. They just collect who's on your board and where does your money come from. But there's no one government executive that could say, we will open up the data and have the information pour out. This is a real complex landscape with no single source that's reliable. And the information's always changing. Staff might come and go, which changes, how you actually access a service. Funding comes and goes. And most importantly, I wasn't even able to fit this on this slide, and this is the worst slide that I have in this deck, I promise. Most importantly, the organizations that provide services to people who don't pay them for those services have no incentives to be found by more people. They're usually not paid by their funder per person they're serving. People don't realize that, but you're usually not paid on a per person basis by your philanthropy or government contracts or whatever. And if you are, in rare cases, paid per person that you serve, it's usually not enough to compensate for the cost of the service. So the reality is that these organizations, government or nonprofit, that are serving people, they don't have incentives to be listed in anybody's directory. They're not. It was something that I did personally when people asked me, to list our organization's information. And after I did it a couple of times, it took me over an hour each time because we were a large organization with many different services and many different facilities. And eventually my own boss was like, nobody else does that. You don't need to answer those calls. And that's when I understood why this was such a hard problem, because we were a pretty good organization, pretty responsive. And it was clear that like people generally who knew about us knew how to find us. In the aggregate, obviously, that's not a good method for handling important information at scale. So this became it's a systemic problem. And for decades, there's been a field of infomerciaries, meaning information intermediaries, conventionally known as information and referral providers, INRs, usually operating hotlines. They've been around since the 80s or 70s or before, and in the late 90s, they formed the 211 hotline, which is a sort of decentralized model for information and referral. These hotlines have a call center with inbound callers receiving calls from people seeking help, and also outbound callers making calls to organizations trying to figure out where people can go to get help. And the information and referral sector is represented by the Alliance of Information and Referral Systems, which is a trade association representing more than 1,200 organizations, mostly old school nonprofits. And over the last 15 years, and this emerged as I was watching this problem as an interested party, that there have been a whole class of startups. You might be familiar with NowPow, which emerged in Chicago, maybe back in 2012 or 2014. Community RX, it was called before then. Activate Care, Unite Us, Healthify, Aunt Bertha, or now Find Help. There's all kinds of efforts to build the Yelps or the Ubers or the Open Tables of social services. Most of these startups got their start scraping the websites of the nonprofit organizations that collect this information manually, and they try to sell their websites to nonprofit, to foundations or health insurance companies or so on and so forth. This is a simplified version of what you end up with. Is many different organizations chasing the same information in competition with each other. What you might call this is an anti-commons. That's a somewhat academic term. I'll share a link to a paper that defines it in more detail. But essentially, you have many different organizations chasing the same information. Supply goes up, but demand is not met. You have more and more sources of less and less trustworthy information, because the more times you get a phone call at any of these social service organizations saying, please fill out your directory, the less likely you are to respond to any of them. So this ends up as a collective action problem in which everybody loses. So to come back to where I started, what this means is every time somebody stands up and says, we're going to build a website that'll be the clearinghouse, the centralized place where you can get all the information available to people in need, that well-intentioned effort is actually probably going to make this problem worse. It is not difficult to build a website. It is very difficult to maintain the information that you would want to make available on this website. And to date, nobody has successfully solved the collective action problem that would get organizations to go to your pretty website and update their own information, because they don't have the incentives to do it. So again, the typical logic of just build a site, fail fast, beat everybody else in the market, build the killer app, it ends up making this problem worse. And unfortunately, that is the sort of readily available answer for people who have good intentions and show up and learn about this problem. They're like, we'll build a website to solve it. And I'm here to tell y'all 15 years later, it's not helping. So here's the question. After going through this cycle of well-intentioned failure over and over again, we started thinking, those of us in the District of Columbia who were learning about this problem, what would it look like if we didn't just have one website, a centralized clearinghouse? What would it look like to have an information ecosystem in which the same information could be available on many different websites? The same information on Google and mobile apps and electronic medical record systems. We started thinking about this problem less in terms of apps and more in terms of infrastructure. And for that vision, I identified a sort of hypothetical set of steps that would have to be taken. We would need, in order to build essentially infrastructure like this, right? You remember the slide that I showed a couple of slides ago. This open referral emerged to basically try to make this possible. And again, we are not building a database. I'm actually working on improved visuals because this implies that we have built a database that everybody uses. That's not what we've done. We've developed the standards that communities can use to build this kind of infrastructure that can enable the same information to be shared across many different channels simultaneously. And we help communities develop that infrastructure. But the question of what's the technical architecture, all of that is going to depend on the lay of the land, essentially. So Open Referral is trying to make this kind of infrastructure possible. the first step we took in that direction was to try to develop a universal data standard. And for the first 3 years I was talking about this, whenever I talked about universal standard for community resource information, the likelihood that someone technical, usually a man, would say that, oh, that sounds great, but you should read this XKCD cartoon about universal standards. The likelihood that that would happen was, almost 1. And it was a helpful part of our process to grapple with this XKCD cartoon that you may have seen before, that says, if the situation is that there are 14 competing standards and somebody's like, okay, we need one universal standard that it covers everyone's use cases, then the situation is soon going to be that there are 15 competing standards, similar to the collective action problem of the database, the resource directory database itself. It took us a while to figure out how we could explain how we were going to avoid this collective action problem. And the short version of it is sort of not something that a lot of technologists have experience with, but I'm a community organizer. And in my experience, you make progress by getting people to talk to each other. And if you get people to talk to each other, for instance, people who use some of the 14 different standards, and you support them in that process of communicating and building trust, you can go from a situation where you have 14 competing standards to a situation where multiple standards and the people who work with them say, actually, let's try to cooperate. And what we've done here is change that one word from competing to cooperation. And we've done that by developing an interchange format, right? So anybody can use our standard to translate from any other standard. So we worked with Code for America. They were co-sponsors of our launch back in 2014. We worked with google.org and schema.org and the Alliance of Information and Referral Systems. So we brought representatives of different sectors with different standards to describe resource directory information to the table. We said, in theory, would it be better for everybody if there was a way to translate from call centers to the web and from web to, to these mobile apps and healthcare apps and so on and so forth. And we got everybody to agree in principle, and then we did the hard work of doing that translation. It wasn't actually all that hard. So we developed the human service data specifications, which is in a data exchange format. Here's where it's available. HSDS specifies information about services, organizations that provide the services, the locations at which the services are offered. And this offers essentially a set of terms, a logic model, machine readable formatting, API protocols, and these are not, we didn't publish these expecting people to change the way their internal databases work. These are designed to map anybody's database and your schema. If you have a resource directory, you can map your schema to these specifications, and then you can exchange data with anybody else who's mapped their schema to these specifications. And so that decreases the cost of cooperation by several factors. And it doesn't eliminate those costs, but it removes some of the technical friction involved in getting organizations that have a common interest in sharing the same information to actually find solutions for the maintenance of that information. So these specs, the human service data specifications, after about 4 years of development and showing that various stakeholders across these sectors and in multiple countries were adopting them, the Alliance of Information and Referral Systems, the trade association I mentioned earlier, they endorsed these specifications as industry standards. Before that happened, I was careful not to refer to them as standards because that word has baggage in a lot of places. But now, the industry association, the only game in town is now saying, okay, this is the method that we expect vendors to use to publish this information. So this was a big breakthrough. It accomplished the first of our very small number of objectives in this field. And since then, we've had an ecosystem of tools that have emerged. the problem of building a website to navigate a directory is solved. There are many websites that are open source that provide you different ways of browsing a resource directory. It's not hard, and it's not hard to build them, but now they're done, and that saved many organizations $250,000, $500,000, $1 million by deploying a website that's already been built and adapting it to their needs rather than starting from scratch. And if anybody out there is interested in using any of these code bases, I'd be glad to talk to you about the advantages and disadvantages. This is cool. This is some of the most valuable, like, hard outcomes that we've had from our work, is helping organizations avoid reinventing any website wheels. But it doesn't answer the big question. Those websites all depend on reliable maintenance of information, and that reliable maintenance of information requires people to make phone calls. If you want good information about services, you've got to make phone calls over and over and over again. And you probably have to be trained to ask the right questions, and you probably have to be managed and monitored to make sure you're doing it right. It's work. The crowd won't do it magically. The wiki efforts have failed. And so the question is, if this information ought to be a public good, information about government services, tax deductibly funded services, services available to people in need, if it ought to be available as a public good, available in any number of websites, findable in Google, accessible through startups or your local case managers, Salesforce system or whatever, what have you, how's it going to be maintained? Who's going to be responsible for its maintenance? We've developed a framework for helping communities answer that question. And I have a second half to this talk that I will be glad to walk through to explain some of the models that we're helping communities develop for sustainable production of resource directory information as a public good. But I've talked a lot already, so I'll pause here and see what questions have come up, if any, before we dive into the question of what we should actually do about this problem. So again, thanks for having me, and I'm looking forward to hear what kind of questions y'all have.
No, thank you so much. We have a couple questions, but I think we'll definitely be interested to hear more about sort of like that answer to that question. But the first question we have here right now, one viewer says they're curious if there are other data standards or data standard development / governance processes that served as particular inspirations for your approach to this.
Oh, great question. So initially, the initial inspiration for the technical design of our data standard was the general transit feed specification, which at the time was still a few years old. This was an initiative that Google supported. It specifies information about transit routes. It's like 3 CSV files, and the simplicity was very appealing. Also, the fact that Google got behind it, like, made it a standard immediately. So we wanted to sort of like ride on those coattails. That said, our initial goal of expressing this information in a simple format that could be 3 CSVs, it just didn't work out like that. The realm of human services is just more complex than transit routes, which are just like schedule, place, and so on. Human services, it's a mess. It's just really messy. You can have, like I said, multiple services in multiple locations, and each, like, a given service at different locations might have different eligibility criteria, different hours of operation. It's a mess. So we didn't live up to the technical vision of simplicity that was embodied by the general transit feed specification. Our spec ended up with, like, I don't know, 8 and then maybe 12 CSV tables. I don't know if I want to get into like the technical specs unless people have more questions. But I think the more interesting reference points for standards, first of all, I did go deep on the history of standards, and I want to shout out Andrew Russell's book, Open Standards in the Digital Age. as a terrific way to think through the history of standards, going all the way back to like the 19th century, industrial legislatures that first created standards through IBM and the history of Ma Bell, and then the World Wide Web. What I find is in these spaces, the innovation-y spaces, I find a tremendous amount of skepticism, specifically from technical American men. Skepticism that I don't find anywhere else with any other people about the value of standards. It seems like there's a little subculture that doesn't seem super versed in the history of the internet, even though they live on the internet. And they're like, yeah, standards, standards are great. There are so many of them, right? Like there's all these like little shorthanded ways that they can try to diffuse conversations. And those conversations are essentially about like, will we work together? Yes or no? Like that's really ultimately what standards are about. Will there be some framework of accountability, some basic agreements that we have to make things work together? And I think in this particular subculture that I'm, somewhat reluctantly familiar with, that is not entirely, but to some extent indicative of the sort of civic tech culture. I think there's a sense of sort of cowboy adventurism that doesn't really lend itself to learning the lessons of history behind standards. And I find it really valuable to actually learn how industries before the internet figured out how to do things in a way that didn't create a big mess. Because they did in the past when they were developing, fire hydrants. And a fire hydrant in one city, wouldn't work with the hoses from the fire department in another city, because it was just like the cities just did their own things and it caused people to die, right? And learning about how industries in the past actually got together and said, we got to figure this out, and companies would send delegates to complex processes to figure out how they were actually going to work together. It does remind you that it is possible to decide together how things will work. And so, yeah, there are some other standards that I think are doing this. We work with the Open Data Services Cooperative, which develops quite a few related standards in the field, like the Open Contracting Data Standard, the 360 giving standard, which is actually only really popular in the UK, but for grants in the UK, they've sort of like taken over the philanthropy sector. And there's quite a few others. Ultimately, I think ultimately, I think this actually is an area that the entire civic tech space would benefit from sort of re-examining. Is the question of, if we've gone a generation through the process of just cycles of booms and busts, it may be time to revisit our prior assumptions and see whether actually committing to the boring and unsexy work of standards development is actually something that might help avert the kind of systemic recurring failures that we've seen in the sector over the last 15 years. So sorry for my rant, but that was a good question.
Yeah, no, that was great. The asker of that question said that this approach sounds very GTFSy, which is why they asked.
There you go.
All right, another question we have here, as producers of map cooperatives themselves, they're exploring the possibility of smart contracts where data owners get paid for their entries and searchers pay. What do you think about that approach?
So, we are trying to figure out how to compensate data stewardship. The work of ensuring that data is collected and reliable is usually obscured by talk of innovation and by website, fixation and human-centered design. And it's like, actually, that's the important work that needs our attention, right? all these fun, sexy things that we want to happen can only happen if the very boring, unsexy work of data stewardship is appropriately invested in. And to the extent that the innovation makes it harder to actually focus on that, then the innovation is a problem. And unfortunately, I feel like there's a little bit of that in the smart contract discourse of just like, oh, there's this magical way to just like make everything automatic and it'll all work out. Everybody's incentives will just align because of this like awesome technology. And so I don't want to dismiss it out of hand, but it seems to me like another attempt to try to automate away what actually is the most important work, which is people talking to each other about what kind of agreements they need to make, and then figuring out how they're going to hold themselves to those agreements. And I actually think like if a smart contract was going to work, you'd have to do all that interpersonal stuff anyways, in such a way that the actual technical stuff would become an implementation detail that may or may not be the right one. And so I don't see, I've been paying attention to that stuff for over a decade now, and it has seemed less and less likely to be the appropriate answer to any particular question. And I'm just, that doesn't mean you shouldn't experiment with some of this stuff, but my concern is like the opportunity cost of just like hoping that technology will deliver us from some of these political problems. That's all time that you could spend actually working on the political problems, right? Actually working on like, let's get together and talk to each other about how we have common interests and how we can work together towards those common interests. My fear is that the technology doesn't actually solve that. And if it doesn't solve it, then it's actually going to bite you in the ass in the end.
Gotcha. All right. So this question just like asked for a little bit more clarification about the project, in that it's just not a directory itself, but that you're helping others build directories. And
so Open Referral is open community of practice. It is fiscally sponsored by Aspiration, which is a 501c3 in San Francisco that provides capacity building and technical support to nonprofit open source social good projects. So we are not our own organization. We have a legal backer, but we also don't build like the technology that we want people to use unless you consider the data specifications and the tools that help people adopt those data specifications to be technologies. Our core product is just these tools for interoperability. People in our community have built websites, databases, other like end user technologies with those specs, and those are open source. We promote them, but we don't assume responsibility for them. We don't assume responsibility for holding anybody's data. Basically, like if you all in a community, if there's like an organization that maintains a directory and they have a database, they have a website, that's great. They could adopt Open Referral and publish their data for others to use. They don't need our involvement. They don't need nothing has to go through anybody's like our servers. The way it becomes sustainable is now that it's a standard, a lot of organizations are expected to adopt it, this method of publishing data. So there's some technical support that sometimes they need, but more importantly, a lot of those organizations realize like it's a whole new world now, right? Now that we've made it possible for this information to just flow between systems, there's all kinds of new strategic possibilities. And so, at any given time, there's a handful of those organizations who come to me asking to contract with me as a consultant. They don't need me, but they can pay for my help in designing strategies, facilitating conversations, brokering mutually beneficial value propositions between them and their competitors. So Open Referral is really about developing the tools for interoperability and then building the capacities to make that a reality. But it's very much us doing like helping others help themselves rather than us trying to solve this problem for people.
Thank you so much for that clarification and kind of elaborating a little bit more. This a person asks if you've developed surveys for specific service categories, which can be used to collect or organize data for those categories.
So that's a couple different questions, it sounds like. There's the question of if we've developed surveys to collect information, we have processes that are sort of like best practices that we can point to. But if anybody's interested in like thinking through like clever new ways of building interfaces that might make it easier to collect this information, I'd be glad to talk to y'all, because we do have pilot projects where, you know, we're like starting to be like, okay, which parts of this could be automated, right? Or which parts of this could be easier. But I think the other part of that question sounded like it's about the taxonomy problem. And normally I don't include this in my talks because it's like, it's really nerdy. But it doesn't really help us get to the point. But since you brought it up, like the human service data specification lays out like the facts, like here's how you structure the facts about like an organization's contact person or their hours of operation or so on and so forth. Whereas the category, what type of service is it? It's actually not a fact. That's like a story, right? And we don't try to standardize the stories, right? Open Referral said, you know, our data specifications say, here's where you insert your taxonomy of different types of services. And I know that sounds like a cop-out, but honestly, like, there is not a right answer as to like what should this service be, like what type of service is this? You might have multiple different conflicting and valid answers to the question of what type of service is this, right? Behavioral health inpatient treatment versus rehab. For some types of stakeholders, the former is definitely right and needs to be used, whereas for many types of people, the latter is actually what you want, right? And so the taxonomy problem is one that we have sort of strategically punted on. But if anybody out there is interested in thinking about that kind of problem, I would like to hear from you and discuss with you. So.
All right, well, thank you for that insight. So this person wants to know what the role of local/federal government is in mandating or maintaining these certain types of standards.
Great question. Okay, so when I'm talking to a government stakeholder, I usually adopt the following frame, which is that there's a universe of services, and you might think about that universe in terms of tiers. And let's say there's 3 tiers, and the first tier, tier 1, are the services that you, the government, provide yourself. So a local government might provide any number of human services. Federal government probably only provides a handful of services itself to regular people. Social Security, the VA, the federal government mostly allocates money to states, and states allocate money downwards, but for a city, many of the services available to residents of the city are provided by the city government. That's tier 1, and the city government ought to be publishing reliable information about the services that they fund. And now that Open Referral's data specifications are standards, it becomes, I don't want to say easy, but a straightforward action that any city can take is to nail that tier 1, right? And I want to say easy because probably you got to figure out who's going to collect information about all these services, right? It's probably not being collected in any one place, but that is a straightforward and logical role for a city to play, is to be like, we are going to be a reliable source of information about these services, and we can publish it in this machine readable way. And I'm actually going to talk about this next, like the concept of a register. Basically, what we call this is a register of city services. New York City's done this to an extent. We're working with DC. Several DC government agencies are doing this. That's a clear and significant lift that only gets a piece of the whole universe of services, but that is a transformative step that the government can take. Tier 2 from a government's perspective. If tier 1 is the services that they provide, tier 2 is the services that they fund, grants, contracts, etc. Capturing all that information might require procurement policy change, as well as other steps, but that would be the other straightforward, no-brainer kind of thing. Like the government should be making sure that information about the services that it funds is available in a machine-readable and reliable way. And requiring organizations to produce that information as a condition of contracting, that is a helpful first step. It's not sufficient, which we'll talk about in a bit, but it's certainly helpful. Tier 3 is everything else. And most city governments are not going to care about the services that they don't provide and they don't fund. It's just going to be like, that's not our responsibility. But they still could play a role in galvanizing the sector to get that whole universe together, which is to say they probably contract for care coordination initiatives or resource directory initiatives. Like any given city government is probably either maintaining and or contracting the production of resource directories. Usually I find like at least a dozen. They might not be well maintained. They're almost never used, but it's still like, you know, this or that agency is like, we should do something. And so the government could require its contractors as again, a procurement policy to adopt open standards and to publish open data about any of the services that, you know, they collect information about using public funds. So those are the different roles that right off the bat a government can play, in addition to just like helping convene and sort of like encouraging market actors to do the right thing and that sort of thing. All right. I know I think we might be approaching, you know, the end of our time. So I want to get back and review the different models for how we would solve this problem in an infrastructural way. But did you have any other questions that I might want to hear?
I was just about to suggest that, so
Great.
absolutely go ahead.
Okay, cool. So I covered part of this, but let me, where did it go? There we go. Okay. So I'm going to share again. Okay. So again, the question is, you can't see my screen yet, right? So hold on. Why is that not showing up? Okay, got it. Okay, so the question is, if this information is going to be reliably maintained, who would be responsible for maintaining it, and how could that labor be sustained? I'll talk through 3 different models. When I started this work, I was like, we'll just put up a wiki and the crowd will maintain it. And it didn't work. People warned me it wasn't going to work. I was like, you don't understand technology, but it definitely did not work. And that's because it's not like Wikipedia where there's hundreds of millions of people who have this information, right? There might be dozens of people in a community who have this information in their head on a day-to-day basis, if that, and they're probably not going to spend their time on a wiki just because you put it up. So the question is, under what circumstances will this work get done? And we offer 3 different models, which could, you know, also have some sort of wiki component, crowdsourcing component, but as a tactical complement to this core institutional design. So one we call a service registry, which is an official list. The other we call a data utility, which is some centralized organization that provides this as a service to the community. And the third we call a collaborative, or if you're being ambitious, a federation. And I'll talk through each one. So a register is an official list, and a service register would be a canonical open data list of all the services available in a given domain. This is like sort of the smallest model, because an official list can only be established, you know, presumably by some sort of authority. And like we said, there's no one authority that covers all these domains, but a foundation, a government agency that contracts or gives grants, those kinds of authorities, or even a non-funding, like accrediting institution or a food bank that delivers food to food pantries. Those could be authority institutions that require anybody who they do business with, who provides services within their remit, to update their information in a registry. And the key step here is that we don't assume that that requirement is enough. You still need monitoring and compliance. And so this diagram here shows a somewhat complex way of explaining a service register. I have these diagrams in a white paper that I will share in a link so people can follow up on this. So you have here up at the top a funder, but it could be any authority institution. It could be an accrediting agency, licensing agency, et cetera. But let's say they, in some way, service providers, which you see at the bottom, are accountable to that funder, and their funder or their authority institution requires them to update their own information in a register. The key is that for a register to be reliable, the requirement is not sufficient. You want to trust, but you have to verify. So a data custodian needs to be in place to ensure compliance, to receive feedback about incorrect information and address that feedback. But the idea is that this is work worth doing now that there are standards, because that information can be captured and published as a canonical open data source. It can be integrated with other open data sources. It is a piece of this puzzle, right? It won't scale to solve the whole problem, but it could be a useful place to start with a register. And by the way, in the top left, you can see we've also expressed these models as haiku. Self-updated list, authority requires it, monitored for trust. Okay, so the next model, just a couple of examples. New York City is publishing, I actually wouldn't call it an official register because they're publishing data about all their contractors out of their contracting system. But it is at least official data that came from the contracting system. It's not being like actively updated yet, which I think you'd need for it to be considered official, but they're at least publishing open data about the services that they contract. So the second model, a data utility, like a power company. And in this, it's like a centralized, some organization is responsible for maintaining what might be hundreds of organizations and might take multiple full-time employees, and they're providing it as a public good, open data. And the key here is that a utility has to be sustainable. And ideally, a government would just fund it, but in many places in this country, that's not how we roll. So we are developing this model with an eye towards sustainable revenue generated from premium services and value-adding features. So the data is provided as an open data public good, but many of the organizations like your NowPows, your hospitals, your health insurance companies, or even government agencies that might benefit from their data, what we found, and this is true of other open data initiatives, is, if the data is freely available and an organization might use it, that's nice for them. But if they're going to actually operationalize the use of that data, they need guarantees. They need contractual guarantees. They probably want premium features. Maybe the data is available for free, but the API is rate limited. Maybe the data is available for free, but it's only updated once a quarter, and they want daily updates or weekly updates. They want to be able to submit a ticket and get that ticket addressed within 48 hours. Maybe there's an API, they could build their own website, but the data utility could white label a website for them for a fee. So we are working with 211s and other information and referral providers to try to help them evolve into this model. Instead of them trying to charge for their data, we're trying to help them understand that their data is more valuable if everybody uses it, and they're able to charge more people for services associated with the data, services that add value to the data, if they become a sort of baseline provider of this data as a service to everybody. So again, the haiku is: one steward maintains open access database, pay for premium.
All right, so we are at time. Would you be able to just kind of summarize the last model and
the last model is the most ambitious, the most technically difficult. It's also the simplest to understand. Multiple organizations maintaining overlapping databases cooperate with each other. Presumably they do so because they can get collectively higher quality data at lower collective costs. The diagram here is pretty simple. Bunch of organizations, bunch of data custodians, bunch of information systems, they can cooperate. You can call this a federation or a collaborative. Ultimately, this is the problem that we need to solve. In order to do that, understanding the first two models, which ultimately are not either or, they can be combined. They are probably best complementary. a collaborative is most likely to succeed if you have a utility that's going to bottom line it. A utility can operate registers, for a fee for funders, and they can all work together. So we're trying to build towards this vision. There are some technical challenges here that we haven't yet solved about how to federate resource data. If folks in Chicago, we work through pilot projects. I'll skip a couple. We work through pilot projects. We bring people together to help them figure out how to go from where they are, to progressively more valuable steps on the way towards that complex, ambitious vision. So if you know folks who maintain a resource directory in Chicago in the area, or who are trying to develop some sort of initiative to connect people to services, we'd be glad to talk about ways to bring these practices to bear, to set people up to use already developed open source software, to help you avoid the mistakes that we've made over and over and over again, so that we can work together to make more interesting mistakes and find new paths through this complex problem. So thank you all. Thanks for letting me go a couple minutes over.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you so much, Greg and Mary, for this presentations. Really illuminating just on the standards problem in this space. Yeah, so their information is on the screen. So it is 8:03 right now. So we're going to transition. If you want to, you can, there we go. Yeah, stop on your screen. And then, yeah, so we're going to head over to our post-presentation live stream right now. Again, intros, announcements, breakout groups. So you can head to the remote Zoom link right now and make sure you follow our code of conduct. And of course, at the end of every presentation, we have our Shy Hack Night catchphrase, which is to go forth and hack. All right, thanks everybody.